Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Ahrens, and today we'll be looking at a subtle effect that has some surprisingly powerful repercussions, if used in the right place. When we perform Mozart, we are often tasked with creating a sense of atmosphere or character, using music which is continuous in nature. This task in itself is not too difficult once we establish what we want. After all, if the music is continuous, we have the advantage that the material is somewhat uniform. So once we create or change an atmosphere, we simply have to keep doing more of the same. There are times, however, when we can enhance the communicative aspects of the music by adjusting elements of the articulation, ultimately creating a continuous phrase that subtly shifts from one emotion to another, like light reflecting off of different facets of a slowly rotating crystal. In today's episode, we'll look at perhaps one of the most obvious examples of this, though this technique can be easily applied to nearly all of Mozart's keyboard output. The first movement of this A minor sonata presents two main aesthetic contrasts: music as represented by a heavily structured and rhythmically focused ideal, and music that is represented through continuous motion. The opening of this movement provides the first, the almost square, musical form. The contrast to this opening appears directly after, in a section that leads to the end of the first half of the movement in almost continuous motion through the melody. This section contains long chains of 16th notes, and their purpose is to provide a kind of ornamented melody that maintains the tension of the piece but also drives it towards the end. It is this section of continuous motion that we'll focus on in this episode. Before we start to look at articulation, let's establish what is happening in this section. First of all, harmonic changes happen either once or twice a bar, with the rare occasion of chords changing on each quarter. Consider this. We have C major in the first bar. Then we have the 2 chord of C major for the second bar. Then we have the dominant of C for the third bar. then the tonic of C once again for the fourth bar. One chord per bar. Once in a while, Mozart will change the chord in the middle of the bar or near the end of the bar to add variety or increase the tension in the music. In the legato section, the first 2 bars have 1 chord per bar, and the last 2 bars change the harmony more than once per bar. Listen for it. This relatively slow harmonic change is a result of Mozart's choice to write a fast movement. To change harmonies on the 8th note scale, as an example, would simply lead to confusion in the ear, as there would not be enough time to process or enjoy the effect in this kind of aesthetic. Now, why is it important for us to consider the rate of harmonic change? Well, with Mozart we have many clues as to possible interpretations of his music, which tend to come from the harmonic choices he makes. He always creates a strong key center, and because of this, he always firmly establishes the dominant and subdominant chords as well. Having a strong key center creates a listening experience whereby the audience will notice quite easily when Mozart moves away from this center. The stronger the frame of reference, the stronger the perception of change from the norm. The rate of harmonic change adds to this perception of change from the norm. If he starts by having 1 chord in a bar for a few bars, and then changes to 2 or more, we notice the difference, and usually it coincides with an increase in harmonic tension. In addition to strong harmonic centers, Mozart tends to write competing character elements within a single key framework, like different characters in his operas singing within the same aria. If a scene is in E-flat major, we might encounter a serious character that is having a duet with a comic relief character, and though the individual characters are different, the overall atmosphere of E-flat major remains stable. We can see different sides of the same key, in other words. In Mozart's keyboard works, we find the same situation. He shows different sides of the same key or atmosphere, and he does this by changing the musical gestures being used, the register on the piano, and the dynamics and articulation. This long section of continuous 16th notes in the sonata is written in C major, without any deviations or developments to a different key. All the harmonic reinforcements are there. So, now let's return to the sonata and see what happens with elements of character. When we look at the characters represented, we find that Mozart links elements of harmonic change, articulation, and rhythmic gesture to differentiate the ideas he wants to have in a single key. Consider this. The first 5 bars are relatively similar in terms of key, harmonic change, and articulation. After this, Mozart writes a single bar-long slur over the right-hand notes for the next 2 bars, while writing long-held notes in the left hand, which are a contrast to the short chords he wrote before. Notice that he's still keeping the harmonic change to once a bar. Now, after this point, he starts to change the harmonies quicker, while removing the slurs from the right hand and altering the gestures to form shorter groups of notes. This leads to the climb that results in the cadential trill, with a break in the left hand so that the ear focuses on this rise, and this creates acoustically a kind of exclamation mark when the Alberti bass appears a bar later, letting us all know that the cadence is coming. When we take these sections and compare them with the harmony that Mozart uses, we see once again a relation between them. The first section of 5 bars that is relatively stable in terms of gesture also completes a harmonic reinforcement of the key of C major. Basically, tonic to dominant to tonic. when Mozart starts the next group of legato gestures, he starts to use some chromatic notes in the melody, sliding back and forth around the principal notes. Harmonically, he starts this section on the supertonic instead of the previous tonic, and because of the minor key nature of this supertonic, the character is immediately different. Compare this with this. Even though the harmonic progression itself is an extended reassertion of what happened before, the combination of chromaticism in the right hand and a different start for the harmony in the left signals to the ear that the atmosphere here is different than before. Bear in mind, too, that the groups of notes in the right hand are extended now to groups of 4, like this. Whereas the first section has the notes in groups of 2, like this. Now, listen to the two groups as written. I think it's important for a moment to mention that regarding the relationships between, say, harmony, gesture, and articulation in Mozart, there is no firm indication that one necessarily dictates the other. In other words, as an example, just because the harmony changes doesn't mean that the articulation must change as well. Mozart writes music that is primarily cohesive and internally consistent, and this means that all these elements are interlinked and not as a result of causation from one to another. The reason that we point out the fact that change happens simultaneously in different expressive techniques is perhaps more to reaffirm the idea that none of these things happen by accident. It's all planned, and when change happens in different modes of expression at the same time, the overall communication of a musical idea becomes stronger. This is where the concern of our episode can now focus. That we can take a musical situation where the harmony and gesture are changing simultaneously and apply a change in articulation as well, which, if done at the right time and circumstance, can make the communicative aspect of the section become stronger. In order to do this, we have to set the articulation elements that are already prescribed in the score. The legato section starting in bar 28 lasts for only 2 bars as written. Everything else is written without any markings at all. In other words, no staccato, no legato. This absence of markings in Mozart generally allows us freedom to decide on an articulation choice, as long as that choice does not interfere with other elements that are already prescribed. For example, the first segment would not benefit from doing legato slurs in 3. Even though this is a creative choice, it interferes with the rhythmic system of the bar, and is thus a distraction and not a merit. Another form of distraction can come from extensions of elements already prescribed. The legato bars as written will only sound special if we remove the legato when Mozart does. If we extended the legato, then the articulation becomes a normal, seemingly universal ingredient, and not a special one. It's even more noticeable if we started the legato earlier in the section. Then we wouldn't notice the application of legato in bars 28 and 29 at all. Articulation and slurring are usually rhythmically motivated in Mozart, and I think it's wise to continue this trend if we are going to invent it ourselves. The first area we can consider is also the easiest to play with a different articulation. The bar after the legato bars is set up in groups of 2 notes. This melodic pattern is very common in Mozart and usually serves to highlight a scale. In this case, it's a downward scale. Because of the technical requirements, we can consider 2 possibilities in articulation. Either the notes are slurred in 2, like this, or they're just simply detached, nearly staccato. This provides an antithesis to the legato that commands the previous bars. Whichever way you do it, you successfully point out the difference in articulation, and you also automatically create a different acoustical character, one that is perhaps less serious and more jocular. This is actually a very important thing to consider. By adjusting your articulation based on score requirements, you've inadvertently adjusted the acoustic experience for the audience so that they have more signals to tell them that something different is happening in the piece. Much of the discussion I hear in masterclasses revolves around encouraging a student to change the end result of their performance. An often heard phrase is, put some more energy or life or character into this section. While this advice is welcome, it is generally rather useless if the student has no idea what elements of their playing are lacking or not contributing to this illusion of life. Our discussion about articulation here is coming at this problem of vitality from the production point of view, rather than the end result. What I'm saying is, try changing these elements of your technique, and life will appear as an automatic byproduct. So far, the adjustments in articulation happen on the level of full bars. It is possible to change the articulation mid-bar as well. Consider the opening bar of this section. You have 2 patterns of notes, one in 4, like this, and the other one in 2s. You could make the decision that the pattern in 4 is more legato than the pattern in 2. As an extreme example, let's do legato for the first half and staccato for the second. When we speed it up to tempo and adjust our articulation so that it's not too extreme, we get a very immediate effect which emphasizes and amplifies the differences in gesture. Anything more than this, in terms of frequency of change, is perhaps overdoing it due to the speed of the piece and speed of the harmonic change. But the point is, you can make a change in articulation that the audience will hear as a subtle shift in character without having to change your dynamics or use rubato to point it out. Another thing that you can do is related to the concept I mentioned earlier, that you make sure that you don't extend techniques across different gestural or harmonic boundaries. Let's say we're going to go with the idea of playing staccato after the 2 legato bars. In the bar after the staccato, Mozart writes a scale passage. In Mozart, it is very common to play scales legato because the aesthetic approach is one of gradual rise and fall, with a matching rise and fall in dynamics. As an aside, When Mozart wants something to be detached, he'll usually write intervallic jumps in slow notes, but both scales and arpeggios are generally legato, if not pedaled through. What we've done by going back to legato after the staccato is point out once again that the staccato section was special and had a purpose, even if that purpose is simply to exaggerate the gestures within and provide a contrast without. Here is the whole section. Listen for the changes. Variety in articulation is a very important element to practice, especially when you're preparing a performance of Mozart. The pianos that he would have performed on were very clear and precise in terms of their articulation, and the expectation certainly existed that articulation was as much of an expressive element as volume. We must remember that sound quality cannot be adjusted on Viennese forte pianos to the extent that they can on modern instruments. And historically, sound quality was really not at the forefront of expression in the late 18th century. Early pianists really only had three tools at their disposal: rubato, dynamics, and articulation. On today's piano, articulation is in many ways the least impactful tool of change, with so much emphasis being placed on quality of sound and creative pedaling to ensure a beautiful singing tone. But this is why we forget articulation, and why it's important to look at it carefully when playing Mozart. It's far more important to his piano works than we think. Occasionally, you can take advantage of a rhythmic situation and plan your articulation accordingly. The second time this running section happens, it's written in A minor as opposed to C major. There are changes in the left-hand articulation as written by Mozart. The overall character is different as well, and he uses different gestures and groupings of notes, which, in my view, require a different articulation. One area which I think is important to note occurs after the legato section. We have the same idea of a detached bar after the legato, but the gesture really encourages us to see the pattern in sets of two notes. It's the same idea as before, with a falling scale, but the difference is that the upper notes are stable, and thus not interesting to the ear. To point them out by playing everything staccato is almost counterintuitive. It is likely that a two-note grouping is more effective in the long run. Now, after this bar, we have a gesture which seems to fall into two sets of 8 notes, slightly off the beat. We can point this out by playing these groups legato, as a contrast to the previous bar, which has sets of 2. This actually sets up the next bar beautifully, and I'll show you why. The next bar is written again in groups of 4, but there is an emphasis on the beat which did not exist in the previous bar. This continues until the end of the trill. notice what Mozart has done from a gestural point of view. We have on the beat legato for 2 bars, sets of 2 for a bar, offbeat scales for a bar, and finally a re-established beat. The offbeat scales are only noticeable because they are a contrast to everything else that happens. And when we adjust our articulation to account for this, we get a very interesting effect. I'll play it slowly so you can hear it. When we pull it up to speed, all of a sudden new characters and changes to the atmosphere of the piece occur. Think of it. This section is in A minor, and all it really does harmonically is reinforce the idea that we're in A minor. But now we have different characters within A minor interacting with each other. I normally place a lot of emphasis on sound quality with my students, usually because in truth, this is an element that seems to require the most attention, and certainly takes a lifetime to develop. Having differentiated articulation is, in many ways, a luxury, if one can afford it in Mozart. His music is very difficult to perform because of the clear texture, the absolute requirements of an even and clean technique, and of course, the precise nature involved in shaping the musical lines. Articulation gets put on the back burner so that we can maintain other areas of sonic perfection. One would rather have an incorrect articulation than an incorrect note, for example, which is more noticeable in performance. But we must remember, in Mozart we cannot use the same amount of rubato and sound quality change as we could in Romantic works. And because Mozart is easily as emotionally driven as later composers, we have to find other means of expressing this that do not interfere with the musical aesthetic. Varied articulation accomplishes this. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing and consider alternative articulations for long passages in Mozart. Remember, his gestures, harmonies, and rhythmic motifs can give you a clue as to what to do. Bye for now.